Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture from Geography Education Online. Today we have joining us Sarah Hall. She's a Professor of Economic Geography at the University of Nottingham. Her research focuses on financial globalisation and the uneven geographies of finance-led development, with a special interest in London's changing relationship with the EU and China. Today, her presentation, New Geographies of Global Money, Chinese Finance in London, takes a closer look at these issues. Now, don't forget, throughout the lecture, you can put your questions and comments in the YouTube comments section. And with that, I'll leave it over to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to make my screen full screen. I assume that's okay, Isabel. Great. So I'm really pleased to speak with you today about Chinese finance in London. And I thought I'd start with this picture, which looks like a traditional bank in London, very kind of traditional architecture. It's taken by myself right in the centre of London, by St Paul's and the Bank of England. But what this photo shows is the centrality of Chinese finance in London. This is actually a picture of one of the largest state-owned Chinese banks, its UK head office right in the centre of London's financial district. And it was this rise of Chinese finance right in the heart of London's financial centre that was the focus of the research project that I'm going to talk to you about today. So as I'm going along, I thought it might be helpful to talk about, or to at least think about, some of the key terms that I'll be engaging with that might be relevant for your studies. So firstly, the talk is definitely about globalisation. It's about the connectedness between London and China. But crucially, I want to suggest that we might tell different stories or different geographies of globalisation if we take as our starting point flows of money from China to London, rather than starting our stories of globalisation in London itself. I think the research also asks really interesting questions about what counts as an economic superpower, and who has power in the global economy. Is it shifting? Is it moving to China? Is London losing out? It raises questions about interconnectedness. So what I want to argue is that what happens in London is increasingly dependent on decisions that are made elsewhere. That might be a decision made by the EU, but for today, it's decisions made in Beijing. The talk also engages with work on TNCs, transnational corporations. So we can think of these banks, like Bank of China, as a transnational company. Often when we think about transnational companies, we think about companies from the UK internationalising and expanding out into the what might be called emerging markets, or the BRICS. But actually what this research suggests is that we also need to think about transnational corporations from those countries, from places like China, opening up in the UK. So changing some of our geographical imaginations, if you like, about who has power in the global economy. So I wanted to start by talking about what financial globalisation is. So back in 1992, one author argued that because of financial globalisation, we were actually seeing the end of geography, that geography would no longer matter. And with the growing rise of IT, online technologies like we're all using now, place wouldn't matter, and financial services could be conducted essentially from anywhere. So we might see the decline of really important centres like New York and London in shaping the international financial system. Now, obviously, as a geographer, this is quite concerning if they're arguing that we're seeing the end of geography. But actually, what geographers have gone on to do since then is to show that in many ways, geography matters even more. It just matters in slightly different ways. So what I'm going to talk about today is what I term new geographies of money, different ways of thinking about financial globalisation. So the first thing I want to do is think about what financial globalisation might mean if we take China as our starting point. So here, as I've said, I really want to emphasise that financial globalisation isn't a process that is led just by Europe or North America, but that China is increasingly active in the international financial system and is starting to shape the international financial system with Chinese characteristics. Secondly, I want to think about the continued importance of geography, and here really argue that it's important to look at financial centres in places like London and New York to show that geography still matters. These centres still really matter in the global economy. But here I want to suggest that it's not just about economic globalisation, it's also about questions of power and politics. So we also need to think about how these centres enable what you might term a form of political globalisation. And then finally, I want to think about, well, why have we got Chinese finance in London? And here I want to draw attention to the questions of interconnectedness and interdependence, and also thinking about Chinese banks as transnational corporations. So hopefully this gives you a flavour of how the talk speaks to some of the topics that you're studying right now. So what is Chinese financial globalisation? Well, the German bank Deutsche Bank argued that it's actually one of the most important developments in global finance since the formation of the euro currency. And what I'm really talking about is the growing use of Chinese finance outside of the borders of China. So the increasing use of Chinese finance in a small number of centres like London. So as I said, and this talk is all about London, but it also includes places like Frankfurt, Luxembourg, etc. And I became really interested in this. I was really interested in why Chinese finance started to become important in London. I'd read a lot of the research that told us that American finance was becoming more important in London, European banks were operating in London, Japanese banks were operating in London. But there was much less written about Chinese finance, and I wanted to understand what was driving this, who were the main players. So from 2015 onwards, I set about securing interviews with individuals working in Chinese finance in London. Really fascinating set of interviews. And I conducted those, and alongside that, looked at the data, some of which I'll be presenting today, to really try and understand how and why London became important in Chinese finance, and why we start to see banks like this appearing right in the centre of London. So it's that research that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm sure you'll be really excited to know that's actually coming out as a book next year. So you're getting a little bit of a sneak preview of that book. So why London? What's the story here? These charts here just give you an idea of the growing influence of Chinese finance, and particularly the growing role of London within this. So if you look at the one in red on the left-hand side, Hong Kong, outside of mainland China, Hong Kong is the most important centre for Chinese finance. And in many ways, that isn't surprising. Hong Kong's obviously immediately next door to China, has very close links with China. But the second ranked country shown there is the UK. And this is what started to spark my interest, because it interested me that, for example, the UK was much more important than the US, than France, for example. On the right-hand side, you can just see a chart that shows which currencies are being used to make payments in the world. So the most commonly used currency is the US dollar. The second most commonly used currency is the euro, then the pound, then the Japanese yen. But there in fifth place, we have Chinese finance, the Chinese currency, which is called the renminbi or RMB. So these just give you an idea that Chinese finance, although we perhaps don't talk about it that much, is actually really important in the international financial system. And the UK is playing quite a unique and important role in that. What's really interesting as geographers about the use of Chinese finance globally is where it's being used. And with a co-author, Laura Marie Terpfer, we mapped that on this map here. So this is a world map that shows you some of the major centres for the use of Chinese finance. Clearly, China's the biggest circle here. But I think this is a really fascinating map. It shows very close connections, a lot of activity in Europe. But this map was completed in 2016, and at that time you can see that North America, the USA in particular, is off the map. This particular type of Chinese finance was not authorised to be used there at all. And for a financial geographer, that's really interesting, because usually if you draw a map of financial globalisation, you would include London, you would include New York, and you would include Tokyo. And interestingly, it's only London of those three cities which is shown on this map. So what's this all about? I think the first point to make is that the growing use of the renminbi, that's the Chinese currency, or the RMB, is a really recent and rapid change within financial globalisation. So prior to 2004, about 15 years ago, you weren't allowed to use the Chinese currency, the RMB, outside of mainland China. And basically, you've gone from that position to the situation that I showed on the previous chart, where the Chinese currency is possibly the 5th most widely used currency globally. And you're starting to see headlines, such as the one shown here, about the growing power of Chinese finance right in the heart of the financial system. So how have people tried to understand this? What sort of research has been going on into this sort of growing power of Chinese finance? Well, I think one point to make is that outside of geography, a lot of people have been focusing on the national level and trying to think about the extent to which China might challenge the US as the most important country within the international financial system. And these are just some pictures of books I've taken in my own collection, of books written largely by researchers in international politics who've looked into this. And the big questions that these authors are interested in is the extent to which the Chinese currency might challenge the US dollar and become the most important currency in the world economy. So they're interested in, are we seeing a continued importance of the US dollar? Are we seeing an emerging dominance for the RMB, the Chinese currency? Or are we actually going to be moving to more of a multipolar international financial system where both the US and China have important roles to play? And I think this kind of research has become even more important recently, as we've seen increasing tensions between the US and China in terms of trade in particular. So I think this is definitely a dynamic to watch in terms of who's driving globalization. But as I said, I've been quite interested in how the accounts of globalization might change if we change our own starting points. So rather than thinking or taking as our starting point American dominance, what happens if we start to think about flows of finance from China to the UK? And crucially, what happens if we change the scale of our analysis? So those previous researchers were focusing particularly on the national scale, and I'm really interested in what happens if we look at what's happening at the urban scale in cities like London or in cities like Beijing, rather than taking a national approach. And I think this really matters, not just in terms of London, but in terms of cities across the UK. So we know that there's a lot of Chinese investment coming into the UK, and it's starting to shape our urban form and our urban fabric in quite important ways. So this is just an example of the growing use of buy-to-let landlords who are actually Chinese investors buying up flats in cities like Manchester. So if we want to think about an urban perspective and thinking particularly about financial centres, there's a lot of work in geography that I think some of you will be learning at A-level, but also that we teach a lot at university, that thinks about why some cities are so important in global finance. And we call those key cities international financial centres. London would be one of the leading ones, but also New York and Tokyo. So these international financial centres are key sites, key controlling sites within the international financial system. They're small parts of cities. It's not all of London. It's concentrated in particular parts of London. And they are typically parts of cities that have a large concentration of financial firms, of banks, of regulators, and related services. So things like legal services, accounting, etc. So, and there's different levels of these cities. So what research has shown is that some cities matter more than others. So this is research from a group at Loughborough University called the Globalisation and World Cities Group, where they basically have ranked key cities in the world economy into alpha world cities, the most powerful, of which London would be an example, and beta world cities, so a sort of second order of importance. And then finally, gamma world cities, so less important cities, they would argue, in the world economy. And this ranking of particular financial centres has become quite important outside of academic research. And there's a whole consultancy industry that now ranks financial centres to work out or to try and show which ones are the most important in the international financial system. These are the rankings taken from 2016, and I wanted to show this one in particular because I thought the cover of the report was really interesting. I think it sends a really clear signal as to how the authors of this report felt that China was going to become particularly more important within global finance. But actually, if you look at the rankings, you can see the dominance of London and New York. So this chart just supports that and really shows that two financial centres have been the most important over time historically, certainly since the mid-1970s. That's London and New York, shown here by the green and blue lines. There's a lot of debate currently as to which one of those two is the most important, and actually increasingly a sense that London might be losing some of its competitive advantage. But then by comparison, I've here charted three Asian financial centres, Hong Kong in yellow, Singapore in red, and Tokyo in purple. And the key point to make here is that although these centres are currently not showing as being as important as London and New York, I think you can see by the upward trend in those lines that they're becoming more important. So we might be seeing a growing influence of Asia within global finance. Just for interest here, there's a sort of deep dive into what's going on in London, in Europe, sorry. So here you've got London shown in the purple line, still more influential according to these rankings than other European centres. And then in the other four colours, you have Zurich, Frankfurt, Luxembourg, and Geneva. And again, here you can see them starting to close the gap on London. This is an area that people are watching really closely in terms of Brexit. So why are these financial centres? Why does focusing on financial centres help us understand this? Well, it's really been led by the work, particularly of scholars such as Saskia Sassen, and a photograph of her book is shown here. And she argues that financial centres can be thought of as global cities, as really key sites in controlling and shaping the financial system. So for authors such as this, finance doesn't circulate around the world in a kind of non-geographical way. Financial firms come together and cluster in a small number of leading cities. And they argue that this is because when these firms cluster, banks and their customers can develop close trust-based relationships that allows them to deliver financial services. I think when you apply this approach to the case of the Chinese currency and its globalisation, if you like, it's helpful because it allows us to think about who is using the Chinese currency outside of China and why are they using it? And by extension, what's London's role within this? So here, I've just charted the kind of four initially important cities within Chinese currency internationalization. So we have Hong Kong, which I've already said has been very important in this process, Singapore, Taiwan, and London. And if you just look at the second row, which is the volume of RMB in these different centres, you can see that numerically London is not as big as the other centres, and that remains the case. But what's really striking is that London's the only European centre here. And I think that's really interesting. Why was it that London became so keen to be involved in Chinese currency internationalisation? And why did China want to partner with London? So here you don't need to worry about the detail of what each of these colours means, but these are essentially four areas of Chinese financial use in London. And they're charted from 2015 at the bottom to 2020 at the top. And this is here really to show you that there's been quite significant growth in London over the past 5 years. Interestingly, that growth has continued following the vote to leave the EU. So there were some questions about whether when the UK left the EU, it would become a less attractive partner for China. I think that's still an important question, but the data so far isn't showing a significant negative impact in that area. So having ascertained that Chinese finance was growing in London over the 5 years that I've been doing this research, I then became interested in asking people, why London as opposed to New York or Singapore? And I'm just going to share with you some of the interview quotes from the people I spoke with. And the first point they made is that London is a genuinely international financial centre. So London's expertise as a financial centre is fundamentally international. And this is different to New York, for example. The growth of New York as a financial centre has been much more strongly related to the US domestic economy. But because of the imperial history and colonial history around London, there's a sense that it's much more international in outlook and therefore more attractive to international partners. So one banker said to me, London is an international centre in ways that places like New York and Singapore really aren't. This lies in its outlook, the international origin of the financial institutions here, and the backgrounds of people who work here. And so here they're alluding to the waves of globalisation, financial globalisation, that have already taken place in London. So we've had waves of US banks arriving, European banks arriving, Japanese banks arriving, and now Chinese banks arriving. The second reason that people drew attention to was the interconnections and close relationship between London and Beijing. And here, people that I interviewed drew attention to the fact that London had very close links with Hong Kong. And so London was able to learn from what had happened in Hong Kong and apply that to the development of these markets in London. So this all sounds very positive, that London was seen as a really attractive partner for China in terms of economic globalisation. But here I want to draw attention to how economic globalisation is always linked to forms of political globalisation. So firstly, a lot of the support for the initial development of London came from the then Prime Minister David Cameron's government. Him and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, were very keen to use China as a key trading partner for the UK, and that included in relation to finance. So there was political globalisation always there. It was partly driven by political decisions as well as economic decisions. But that then means that if your foreign policy or your diplomatic relations become more strained, that can then limit the opportunities for economic globalisation. And this certainly happened when David Cameron met the Dalai Lama in April 2012. And my research participants frequently spoke about how this really slowed down the globalisation of Chinese finance in London. One person called it a frozen bilateral relationship. It was a freezing cold 2 years, no conversation at all, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what the next step might be. So this just shows the close links between political and economic globalisation. That was then overcome through a series of meetings between particularly the Bank of England governor at the time, Mervyn King, and his counterpart. So such was the kind of attractiveness for economic globalisation. They worked hard to solve those issues. And so from that frozen bilateral relationship, once that had been resolved, you then saw a rapid arrival of Chinese banks into London. So this table shows you the 4 largest Chinese state-owned banks. These were the banks that I was showing you pictures of at the start of the talk. So they're headquartered in London, but in 2014 and 15, these banks were granted bank branch licenses in London and opened branches in London. I think a really important column here is the one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th column over, world ranking of banks, because these, although they might not be familiar names like Barclays or HSBC, these are really powerful banks in global finance, which I think shows the importance of thinking about globalization from China as well as to China. So, for example, ICBC, the first one, is actually the largest bank globally. A Chinese bank is the largest bank globally by capital. And China Construction Bank is ranked 2. And you can see their previous rankings are in brackets, so they're all increasing in importance. And here I've just listed the top 10 world banks, so you can see the growing power of China within global finance. So all of the top 4 are from China, and the next block are from the US. So I think that might be quite striking when, if you ask people to name important banks in the world, I'm not sure that these would always be the names that we would mention. I then want to think a little bit about what this means for London. So here I've shown the clustering of these Chinese financial institutions, banks and law firms in London. So we're in London, we're right in the centre of London, just north of the River Thames, by the Bank of England. The Bank of England is the white dot in the middle, and they're all clustered very closely around the Bank of England. This is really interesting to me because this is the historic heart of London's financial district. So when US banks came to London, a lot of them opened up east of here in Canary Wharf. And some of you may have seen the sort of skyscrapers in Canary Wharf. But Chinese banks have taken a really different approach, and they've clustered right in the historic centre of London's financial district. So I asked a little bit about this, why they've chosen to cluster here. So we've got this sort of emerging cluster of Chinese finance in London. And it was explained to me that this was to replicate their location decisions from Beijing, where they locate very close to key policymakers, key regulators, so that they can learn what's going on. So interestingly, it's argued that this kind of clustering around the Bank of England mimics their location decisions in Beijing. I was also really interested in changing Chinese migration patterns that go along with this into London. And so here I've mapped by national insurance the increase in Chinese nationals right in the centre of London. I haven't spoken about it so much today, but a lot of the research initially on Chinese migration to London was focusing very much on the hospitality sector, in what would be potentially called lower and middle skilled occupations. And I became really interested in how we're now seeing a wave of professional Chinese migration into London. So what do I think, this tells us? I think the main thing it tells us is that geography really still matters in globalisation. We're not seeing the end of geography because of financial globalisation. And what's really interesting is that it's not just geographers who think this. This is a quote from Sam Woods, who's one of the regulators at the Bank of England, where he's arguing that something that he terms geofinance, which is an interesting word, will be the defining challenge of the next few years, thinking about the impact of geography on the organisation of finance in terms of how it shapes where firms locate, how borders matter, and how this shapes financial regulation. I think this is really interesting in terms of flows of Chinese finance into London, but it's also very interesting when we think about Brexit and how the questions of borders and locations may come into play there. So just to wrap up before we look at some questions, I've tried to do a few things in this talk, kind of introduce you to the power of Chinese finance and its growing presence in London. And in doing that, I've tried to think about how we understand what financial globalisation is. So firstly, financial globalisation isn't something that just starts in London and flows out to China. It's increasingly happening the other way around as flows of global finance flow from China to the UK. And I've suggested that we need to think about this partly as economic globalisation, but also about a form of political globalisation, where key policymakers in London were central to the process. I've suggested that financial globalisation, particularly in terms of China, is dynamic, it's not fixed, and there's still quite a lot of uncertainties. So what does it mean about the growing power of China within the world economy? How might it impact London's future role as a leading financial centre? I think these are all really important questions. And I've suggested that thinking about it at the urban scale, so thinking about cities or financial centres, can also shed some really important light on this. And finally, I think through the talk, one of the things that comes through is thinking about how we tell our geographical stories. And it's partly about questions of presentation. So actually maps really matter, and some of the key points that I get across in this work are actually through maps of the clustering of banks in London, maps of where Chinese finance is and isn't, and maps of who's working in global finance. So I will leave it there, and I think, Isabel, we can look at some questions. Oh, I think you're muted, Isabel.
I am. Thank you for your presentation. That was really interesting, and it covered a lot of different aspects. Certainly, you're talking about the interplay between different countries and politics and finance, and yeah, it's really interesting to hear about. Now, I've opened the floor to questions. So, of course, anybody who's watching, if you would like to ask Sarah any questions, please put them into the comments part of the chat on YouTube, and we'll get to you one by one. Our first question comes from Geography in Your Jammers. And the question is, has there been a similar clustering of financial firms from China into sub-Saharan Africa?
That's a really good question. So I know less about what Chinese financial firms are doing in terms of their locations in Africa, but I do know that there's really significant Chinese investment into Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. And this is part of something that's called the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. So China has an ambition to build kind of a connecting route between China and Eastern Europe, essentially encompassing sub-Saharan Africa. And that has a really important financial strand to it, which is in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right, okay. And we've got a second question as well. My understanding of global finance is a bit limited. Can you explain the concept of financial globalization again?
Yeah, so if globalization means the kind of growing interconnectedness between places, financial globalization looks at that, but thinks particularly about how our monetary relations are globally connected. So, for example, if I use my credit card in continental Europe. I might be using a payment service in Europe, but then I'll be billed back in the UK. So my own kind of personal financial relations become more related to other countries than a purely kind of national-based financial and banking system.
Right. Okay. Hopefully that answered your question. Are there any more questions from the audience? Feel free to write them in, whatever they are. In fact, I had a question of my own, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, go on.
It's focusing mostly on London and the way that the banks are clustered around certain areas in London. Have you noticed any similar developments at other cities in England, specifically in the UK, or is it really focused on the city?
So in some other cities, so Bristol would be a good example, or Edinburgh, there are clusters of financial institutions, but the UK is really unusual in that the extent to which this happens in London compared to other cities is really, really significantly greater. So when you think about those rankings of financial centres that I mentioned, very few UK cities, apart from London, figure highly in those rankings. Edinburgh would be a really notable exception to that.
Yeah, because it's interesting because obviously China has had interests in other industries around the UK, but obviously the banking centre really is in London. Yeah. Okay, so we've got another question from Stacey Hutchinson. Do you think that exports have a big role to play in which currency is the most used globally?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So it is very much linked to exports and how countries are paying for their exports and whether they're paying for exports in sterling, the UK currency, or in China. But that's a really great question because one of the things we try to do when we research money and finance is show that money and finance isn't something separate from the real economy. It actually matters for firms, for households, for kind of everyday finance.
Right, okay, yeah. Oh, we've got a supplementary question on the last one about global finance and financial globalization. Does financial globalization link into the issue of clone towns in which profits are sent elsewhere rather than the local community?
So the clone town debate isn't really used in financial globalization, but that does raise an interesting question about the extent to which the growth of financial services in London has trickled out to the rest of the UK. So you might have heard the government currently talking about trying to level up the UK. It's had kind of persistent questions in the UK about uneven regional development. And there's an argument there that although London has benefited from financial services growth, the rest of the UK hasn't to the same extent.
Right, okay. We've got another question from Emily Brown. What made you want to study the Chinese currency?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've always done my research on London's financial district. And most of my research has been interviewing people working in finance about changes in the sector. And I started to pick up that there were growing numbers of Chinese nationals working in London. That's how I initially got into it. So I noticed the labour market change first. And I was really interested in why that was, why people wanted to come and work in London, what was driving those changes. So that's what got me interested in it. But since then, I've been really fortunate to work with great collaborators in Singapore and in China who know a lot more about the specifics of Chinese currency than I do. So it's been a real kind of collaborative project, which has been nice.
Yeah, because of course, a lot of the people that might be watching this today might be thinking about, their choices of what to do if they go to university. Yeah. And so I think it's really interesting to get that perspective of what leads you into your preferred area.
I grew up in the northeast of England, so a long way away from London and financial services. And I initially got into it because I knew I wanted to do geography at university. And when I got there, a lot of people were going to work in London. And I was like, what's all this all about? I grew up in the Northeast, like what's going on? And that's how I became interested in London's economy in particular.
Yes, yeah, it is noticeable that there is that kind of draw from universities all around the country to London for employment. So yeah. So do we have any more questions from anybody coming in on the chat? Yes. Do you think with the current trend of globalisation, we might see an African currency top the rankings in future?
That's a really interesting question. I think we're quite a long way off that at the moment, but I think what could be interesting is if countries in Africa start to use another currency quite significantly. So at the moment, there's real reliance on the US dollar. I think if that started to change, then you could start to see a greater change in the balance of power between different currencies globally.
Do you think a possible competitor for that might be the renminbi, considering the influence that Africa has in China has in Africa? Yeah.
So I think China's definitely viewing that as a geopolitical strategy that it's following. So yeah.
Yeah, certainly for anybody that was watching a couple of weeks ago and watching Jill Miller's presentation about exactly how China has influenced the infrastructure and development of certain places in Africa, that might really be a possibility.
It really to that talk a lot.
It would. It certainly would. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Now, this might be a slightly interesting point brought up. You were talking about specifically about London, the connection between politics and finance. Obviously, there's been a lot of speaking about Hong Kong as regards politics. Do you think that's going to have an effect on financial connections in London?
Yeah, so I think in some ways what I spoke about from 2015 to 2020, I think we might end up looking back on that as a kind of high point in Chinese-UK relations. And certainly with the protests in Hong Kong, with the UK's kind of increasing focus on the US, I would say at the moment, although that could change with the US presidential election, I think there's much less of a political appetite to foster close trading links with China, certainly in the near term. So one of the things I'm really interested in, and I'll be really interested to reflect on in kind of 5-10 years' time, is whether this period looks very distinctive as being a kind of high point of UK-Chinese relations, or if the trends continue. And obviously we just don't know that at the moment, but I think there are some signs that we might look back on this as a kind of high point.
Yes, yeah, quite possibly. Okay, any more questions from anyone in the chat? Or have we seen all we're going to see for today? We certainly had a lot of different aspects of this brought out in the conversation, though. Very interesting with connection back to Africa.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think that's probably a good place to finish up for today. But thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's been great having you with us, and I hope everyone is enjoying it as much. We've got a thank you coming through in the chat as well. Yeah, which thank you, Sarah. It's been really interesting. All right, so with that, my usual refrain at the end of these lectures is don't forget to keep having a look at the Geo website. We have more lectures coming for you, more tutorials, and more content to help you with your studies. And next week, we will be joined by Mark Whitehead, who will be looking at geography in the digital age, the opportunities and challenges of smart technology. and how that can affect geography. Yeah, again, a big change from week to week. So we're always going to bring you something new. Okay, well, with that, thank you, Sarah. And it was lovely having everybody here with us this afternoon. Thank you for your questions and comments, and hopefully see you again next week.
Great, thank you.
Bye.